Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know, you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. This monologue, but in other people's words, has replayed in so many minds. So much so that it has become as widespread as McDonald's or YouTubers asking people to subscribe. Subscribe, by the way. But also, just like McDonald's, too much of a good thing is not a great thing, it's a bad thing. Picasso said, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand." So, what are the ways that this piece of art, The Matrix, is a lie? How is this good thing, just like McDonald's, become too much, too bad, and even cancerous? So, let's look into it. In this video, we're going to look into how a great movie like The Matrix has been used and abused, just seen for the surface level ideas, and then those ideas taken to their worst places. So we're going to look into things like how The Matrix has become code for any group I don't like or understand, and how normies have sadly become the enemy. Then we'll look into how the illusion of instant expertise has made a generation sometimes feel like they can instantly become exactly the kind of expert that they need to be. And then finally, we'll see about the lie of the lonely truth seeker. First, I want to say, I love The Matrix. The Matrix is great in a ton of ways. It has some really amazing ideas. And I rewatch it all the time, but something you have to realize when looking about these things is that so often the things that we might enjoy, that people who really think about these movies might enjoy, is not understood by the broader public. That most people just don't get that. They watch it for the explosions. They watch it for the memes sometimes. Like for a great example, Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith so often has reemerged in pop culture largely for the memes because so many people just think it's a hilarious movie. Now there are a lot of people who really love that movie, but there's still a wider amount that just use it for the memes. And why is this important when it comes to The Matrix? Well, just like a lot of deep movies with fascinating messages, a lot of it can be lost when you're sitting there and you're not really understanding what it's trying to say, when you're just passively experiencing the movie. And sadly, a lot of those messages that have passively seeped into people have been really harmful. And some of those I want to talk about today. Lastly, as far as this preface part, this isn't about the red pill dating movement, okay? Although I might bring them up just to kind of spotlight how this is used and how people talk and think, I'm not talking about the red pill movement. I'm talking about the Matrix and how these ideas sadly have been abused and twisted and used in a very poor way by a lot of people. And that, yes, is true of some of the red pill people, but it's also true of a lot of other people and just the ways that we use it in general, particularly the generation after the movie, and that's of course Gen Z. So the way that we understand that and grapple with those ideas, sadly, I think has come into our modern language in a really poor way. You can see that in things like black pill and white pill and red pill and blue pill. And all these things, they really are a shadow of the version that they were in the movie. They're just a poor representation. I I made a similar point in a video that I made about the names of generations. One of the names, Gen X, our parents' generation, so that's 2 generations ago. The guy who wrote the book where that came from actually railed against marketing. Said, "I don't want to be a marketing ploy, a gimmick." And yet, what did he become? The whole name Gen X has become a giant marketing tool. And in the same way, the Matrix, sadly, and a lot of its ideas have been twisted and used by, in many cases, the exact types of people that the creators wouldn't like. And I'm not saying that as far as it's not okay for them to use it, but I'm just showing how far away something can get from the origin of something, from the creation, all the way to where it is now. So then we get into the first topic, and that is the concept of the Matrix. Sadly, I think the concept of the Matrix itself has been really bastardized and taken away. What do I mean? Well, the Matrix, I think, in a large way, has been taken to simply mean any boogeyman, any group of people, any backroom dealing group or authority, whatever. And the reason why I'm struggling to find words is because people have purposely left it ambiguous. And in the beginning of the movie, it is left somewhat ambiguous. And so people have taken that core concept and simply applied that to any group or authority figure they don't like, any expert they don't like. It becomes the matrix, they, them. And why is that a problem? Because when you make it that way, it makes people the enemy unnecessarily. It makes it so that way anyone that you don't like can be putting things on top of you. And you're the noble rebel, right? You're the independent person thinking for yourself, doing your own research, having your own ideas about the world. And it's the matrix, whether that be your boss, whether that be the government, whether that be corporations, whether that be your friends. It's always the matrix. It's the sheep, right? Or bots. That's a big thing that Sneeko used to say. Or I know Andrew Tate used the idea of the matrix. And again, these are just great examples. I think it's injected into our popular culture, this idea of the matrix is out to get me. That there is some group of people with rules and ideas, and they don't want me to think for myself. They don't want me to stand apart. And it allows you to put off some of the responsibility it would take for you to understand things, for you to understand the world, understand what is stopping you and what is in your way. Because rather than engaging critically in that way, rather than thinking, okay, well, my manager doesn't like this, so what can I do differently? Or what am I saying or how am I coming across as making her think that way? Or what is wrong about that structure? Okay, instead of engaging critically with that concept, it just becomes, well, the matrix is out to get me. They want me not to think for myself. They want me not to have my own ideas. And it allows us to be very intellectually lazy. But see, now this connects to the other point, and that is the dehumanization of the blue pilled. Like I was talking about in the example, and I know I'm kind of picking on them, but they use that language, so I think it's fair game. When people like Sneeko or Andrew Tate say things like the Matrix or bots, they're engaging in this casual dehumanization of blue-pilled or normies. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're someone who lives like a lot of other people live and act the way that a lot of other people act, that doesn't necessarily mean you're the enemy, that there's something wrong with you, that you're a bad person. This like war on people being normal, on people having their normal ideas and kind of acting similar to other people, there's nothing wrong with that. But sadly, one of those surface level ideas that the Matrix perpetuates is this concept that if you are not against the Matrix, if you're not fighting, if you're not independent, then you are in favor of it. Then you are for them. If you're not against the bad people, whoever those bad people might be, like we said before, whoever that boogeyman is, whatever that secret cabal of bad people are, if you're not against them, then you're for them. Then you're on their side. So in this idea, the blue pill people, the normal people, what are they? Well, they're collaborators. That's what they are. They're collaborators on the bad side. They're actually the people who are in line with and supporting, even just tacitly. They're still enemies. And it really is summed up well in this quote by Morpheus. And I'm not going to do as good of a job, but I think it's going to dramatize it a little better if I read it. And that is, he says, the Matrix is a system, Neo, and that system is our enemy. But when you are inside and you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, lawyers, teachers, carpenters, the minds of the very people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of the system, and that makes them our enemy. And you get both of those again. What is that? The system, so that's the matrix, that's the boogeymen, those are the people out to get us. That's the secret system, the cabal, whatever. That's the matrix, that's the system. And then the other hand, what do you have? You have the blue pill people, the people who are in tacit support. They don't realize that there are people out to get us. There are people who don't believe like we do, and therefore they're against us. They're our enemies because they tacitly believe in the system because they don't agree with us. And you can see that it's perfect fusion in that quote. And see, what the problem with that is, well, for one, I shouldn't have to explain why it's terrible to dehumanize people. But not only that, on a big level, Nazis and the whole nine yards. But on a smaller, more micro level, though, it's not just about like, oh, well, if you have this idea and you treat people like that and think about like that, you're going to create Nazis and you're going to become a Nazi one day. Yeah, that's probably true overall. But on the more micro level, people are genuinely doing their best. They really are. If you meet some cashier who, I don't know, has a trans flag on them, and you think that, oh, they're a part of the matrix, they believe in whatever, they believe in the woke bullshit or whatever, writing them off and dehumanizing them is not believing the same way you do, and therefore being your enemy. That misses the truth of who we are. And that is, and it's embedded in that quote, but again, it's like I was talking about earlier, some people miss it. And what's inside that quote? They're just like you and me. They're the exact kind of people that we're trying to save. They're the kind of people that we are trying to help. And so, in the process of ingraining these ideas and kind of imbibing them, what happens? You miss the big part of that. They focus on the end of that quote and not the middle. That those are the people you're trying to help, that you're trying to save. And so, if you disagree with that person at the cashier who has the trans flag, like the way to help them understand that you have the right way of thinking is not to write them off and say that they're a blue pilled enemy. And it's the same way in reverse. Just because someone votes for Trump does not necessarily mean that all of a sudden they are nothing but bought in little robot slaves, that they're the sheep and they'll be a sheep for the rest of their life. Ba ba sheeple. That's not the point. And that misses the connection that we all have, the connection that we should have. And more than just it being a macro thing of we don't want to create another World War II and we don't want it to lead to Stalinists and all this big stuff. Because when people make those arguments on television, on CNN, on MSNBC or Fox News, whatever, and they talk to you like you're some great big demographic, they miss the point that we're human beings and we're not going to affect that much. We're not going to change that much. But when you start treat people like that, that echoes, that ripples in all of your other relationships, because that person is not them anymore. They represent something bigger and larger. So they do something that you dislike, and it's not that thing, right? It's not that one thing that they did. It's not, oh, no big deal, or I wish you hadn't done that. It's no, it stands for something so much broader and bigger. It stands for, oh, well, you're not that type of person because you did that one thing. You now watch that kind of movie, so oh, you're one of those, and it stops you from allowing to truly connect with people. The third thing I want to talk about is the illusion of instant expertise. What do I mean by that? Well, we all remember the time where they were able to just plug in and download all the information that he needed to be suddenly good at martial arts, and he could do flawless taekwondo and jujitsu and on and on. And that's really cool. I still remember being a kid and being like, I wish I could do that with my schoolwork, and thinking that was like the coolest thing ever. And so when I bring this up, you might think instantly, oh, this is just nitpicking, this isn't a big deal. But actually, I think it embodies a kind of a deeper idea that is really pervaded a lot of the online sphere. And what is that? Well, it's this idea that we don't have to work so hard to become knowledgeable about something. Now, I think this has to do with several different things. One of them is social media, because of the idea that it's social and it's media and it's going out to everyone and we all have to have an opinion. What happens? Well, because we're acting like something, we're end up believing that that thing's the case. So more specifically, if something happens and we tweet about it, the more we tweet about that thing, the more we believe, oh well, I have a right to speak about this thing. And to some degree you do. But you don't have a right to be listened to. You don't have a right to be respected. And those things are not the same thing. Those things are not even close. Because just because your uncle has some view on Donald Trump's trade policy does not mean he has any idea of economics. And in so doing, we all don't necessarily have any idea just because we're speaking on something. And so I think that's one way that our modern context has kind of perverted our minds. It's twisted us into thinking that because we can, we should. Just like Jurassic Park. Just because we can, we therefore should be respected for that thing. That we should be taken seriously because we feel that way. And that is not true at all. But the other thing is, it takes a long time for someone to become truly expert at something, truly authoritative on a particular topic. And because of that, that's why they should be taken seriously. That's why expertise is not something we should just throw out. Now, a lot of people can use that, and this is where we get into a very important topic. A lot of people can use that and just say, oh, because they're an expert, I get to turn off my brain, right? And so a lot of people in response have acted in the opposite way. They've acted in a contrarian way and shut off their brains. What do I mean by that? So you have someone who comes up on Fox News, comes up on CNN, and has some sort of expert opinion, right? And some people just nod their heads. Oh, yes, that's exactly right. Well, then you have the opposite people. And those people instantly think it's wrong because they're an expert. Because it says this person has written a book. Because it says this person is a PhD. Because this person says they have an MD on a certain topic. And they're supposed to be an authority. Therefore, they must be wrong. Therefore, because they're propped up by the Matrix. They're propped up by CNN. They're propped up by Fox News. So therefore, they must be bad. They can't know what they're talking about because, after all, they're propped up by people I don't like or I disagree with, or for so long, other people have thought that these people were authorities. And what happened? Well, they were wrong about this thing or that thing, and therefore they're not. And this contrarian impulse allows us or forces us to shut off our brain, a lot of people, because they've seen that some people have been wrong or some experts have been wrong. And the thing about the authority bias and the authority fallacy is that it's actually a lot of times correct. A lot of people don't understand this. They think that, oh, because someone references an authority, therefore we can just ignore it, because that's a fallacy. Just because someone says they're an expert, or just because they have a degree, does not mean necessarily that they're right. And that's kind of true, but not really, because that authority actually is valid if it's speaking on several things. First, it's speaking in their particular domain. So if they accrued knowledge and expertise in a certain area, then appealing to them in that area is actually perfectly legitimate, especially when they've spoken on clear statements on that topic. And you can look this up online. I'm going to link something down below that kind of explains this, because a lot of people don't understand. Just because you appeal to an authority does not mean it's fallacious or wrong or untrue. In fact, a lot of times it can be right, but they have to be speaking on their particular domain. And that's where we get into this giant word. And I think I'm gonna get this wrong. I think it's called ultra trepidarianism. I think that's what it is, and I'll put it down. It's really annoying to say. It's one of those spelling words that you might have gotten as a kid. And what it means is an expert speaking outside of their domain, and that's what this appeal to an authority means. It means an expert speaking outside of it. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, a lot of people, sadly, have taken this illusion of instant expertise, that because I can talk about something, I should be respected on that thing. And because an authority speaks on it that either represents an organization I don't like, or that person has been wrong in the past, therefore I should ignore them altogether. Therefore, they're actively wrong. And this contrarian impulse means that not only are we dismissing the actual authorities, but then furthermore, we feel like, and this gets into the kind of my last sub point on this, which is the internet allows us to feel like we can know whatever we want to know. We can ask ChatGPT, we can ask Claude, we can Google it instantly, we can listen to a podcast. And so we have this illusion that expertise is always at our fingertips, that knowledge is just right there, and all I have to do is just type it in. And if I type it in, then I'll find exactly what I need. And I'll know just as much as someone who's done 10 years, 15 years, who's written 3 books. I'll know just as much as them because I was able to look at the right place. And that illusion of instant expertise, sadly, I think had its origin, or really was popularized with this idea that you can just be plugged in. And with being plugged in and all this knowledge coming to you, that now you're an expert and now you have all that you need. Because in reality, until we get, the meta headsets that Mark Zuckerberg wants to implant into us, that Elon Musk wants to give us, until we get to that point, that is the closest we're going to get. Typing that into our browser, asking an AI, watching a video, that's going to be the closest we can get to actually plugging in. And it shows to me that this concept has its roots in something like the Matrix, and something like this constellation of ideas, and these connection of ideas that the Matrix shows. Lastly, for this part of my Matrix series, my little Matrix mini-series of harmful ideas, I'm going to talk about the overvalorization of skepticism and truth-seeking in isolation. I know that's a whole lot of words, but basically what I'm saying is, we sadly, with movies like The Matrix, other thrillers, we sadly have really put on a pedestal this idea that everything must be questioned. Isn't that what they say? Question everything, question everything. And then the other thing that goes along with this is this truth-seeking in isolation, this feeling like, oh, well, I can do it myself. I can do my own research. I can come to my own conclusion. I can think critically. Now, why is this a problem? And where does this how does it have its roots in the Matrix? Well, first, why is this a problem? Because sadly, for several reasons. First, in reality, truth is not found alone. It's rarely found alone. That's not to say you can't find any truth alone. But even when we think to ourselves, oh, I'm coming to my own conclusion, I'm doing my own research, what are you actually doing? You are going to your computer, you are typing in your search bar, and you're reading articles. And good for you, you should be doing that. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem, though, is this illusion that because we're the ones doing the typing, that we're the ones who are finding the truth or doing our own research. I mean, it's not our own research. We're not the ones collecting the survey data. We're not the ones putting it in the formulas and writing the abstract. That's not us. We're reading someone else's work. And in fact, they're doing the same thing. They're collecting data, they're having people help research with them. So this idea is a total illusion. It's a total delusion as well. It's just making stuff up, because in reality, when you really want to find truth, you get together a team. Like for instance, the movie Oppenheimer, I think, is a great example of this. Because what were they trying to do? They were trying to create one of the biggest breakthroughs in all of the world. And how did they do it? Well, they brought together some of the smartest people in the world. And that indeed is how it is. And just because you're doing that on your browser, just because you're doing that and talking to ChatGPT, does not mean that you're not doing that. You're simply drawing on the work of all these smart people. They might not be in a room with you, but their voices are still the ones that you're listening to. But further, there's another huge trap here. And what is that? Well, it's this valorization, this idealization of skepticism, of cynicism, of questioning everything. Because if it's so hard for you to believe that, for instance, your corporation or your manager might actually care about you, or it's so hard for you to believe that the cashier gives a shit, or just on and on, if that becomes so ingrained in all of us that we question everything, we question, the good intentions of our friends and family, that we question the people that we work with, that we're just questioning, which I think that the Matrix, sadly, on the surface, really perpetuates and really encourages. But when we do all that, we miss some of the big things, and that is, it's somewhat of a contradiction, I think, that among all of human history, we're in the world with the most knowledge. We're in the world that has some of the lowest rates of poverty. In fact, I have some crazy statistics I wanted to put here. And the point of some of these statistics is not to say that there is nothing to do. That, oh, corporations are great, and greed is wonderful, and I really hope that the Trump administration has even more corruption. That's not the point. The point is that it's a contradiction to look at our world today and be so much more skeptical than when there was way more inequality, when there really were kings, when there really were emperors, and you can say, oh, well, it's not that different today. It's like, the problem with that kind of mindset is there are huge ways it is different. I'll give you some examples right now. Now, quoting from ourworldindata.org, 10% of the world's population today lives in extreme poverty. It also, the chart that they're referencing here also says that 200 years ago, the same was true for nearly 80% of the world's population. If you were alive, for instance, in 1800, there was a chance of 9 in 10 that you weren't able to read today. Close to around 2021, I believe, when the survey was done, it was 9 out of 10 people were able to read. So, exact flipping, an exact opposite. But one more big piece that's really interesting. Around 43%, which is nearly half of all of the world's newborns, died before their 5th birthday. And now, according to the data in 2021, child mortality was down to 4%. Now, I don't think anyone's going to argue that more children dying is good. I don't think anyone's going to argue that more people in poverty is good, right? Or that that's not a better place to be than when we were in the past. And so I think, sadly, we as a generation, Gen Z, struggles with this comparison to heaven. So it's this fascinating contradiction we have, that simultaneously we're the most secular, we're the most atheistic, we're the least likely to believe in Christianity or any organized religion. And at the same time, the way that we are skeptical and question institutions, which is a good thing, the way that we complain, and I'm not using that in a bad way, but the way that we complain and criticize about the current state of affairs kind of implies that there's something better, when in reality, this is the best we've gotten so far. And again, you might say, oh, well, that sucks. Like that's really shitty, because we should have a lot better. And I agree with you. Like we're about ready to discover artificial general intelligence. Yes, we should be in Star Trek, and I want to get there, but let's get to Star Trek age. But until that time, we should still have the awareness that heaven, if we don't really believe in heaven, then comparing it, to some greater perfection, some greater idealistic world, is not a fair comparison. And it doesn't put it into the proper mode when we're trying to understand this. So this is what I mean by skepticism and idealizing skepticism. It's that this just asking questions routine, this feeling of immediately second guessing everything, it has the effect of undermining positivity, of undermining trust, like us talked about at the beginning. And this affects not just the macro level, and the way that we criticize, is not helpful because we're comparing to idealized future that doesn't exist, or a perfect reality that doesn't exist, which is true to some degree. Like, that has an element of truth. But more importantly, though, this feeling of having to second guess everything, having to take the piss out of everything, having to be jaded, cynical, and all of this skepticism and questioning, it lends itself to draining the positivity out of things, draining the trust, draining the belief and the gratitude. And I'm not saying we should be grateful for billionaires, or we should be grateful for governments or anything like that, but be grateful for the life that we live. Be grateful for our friends and our family and the food we have. And but when we don't, when we question everything, when everything has got to be negative, when we're always comparing to something better, and part of that, like I said before, is social media. It's video essays, somewhat like mine, criticizing people. Like, we're all playing this part in a negativity ecosphere. But sadly, I think part of the origin was this misinterpreting of the noble ideal of someone like Neo questioning the Matrix, questioning where he was, questioning what he believed in. And that questioning, when taken too far, drains the life, not just out of the positive things around you in society, but out of you yourself. So thanks for looking into it, and in the next part of our Matrix miniseries, we're going to look into why the bad guy might actually be the good guy, and how the savior myth is actually a huge trap. We'll see you then. This is your last chance. After this, there is no going back. You take the blue pill, and the story ends. You wake up in your bed, and you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Without saying it, I know you know what movie this is from. At this point, it seems like it's across half of YouTube. Take the red pill, don't be blue pilled, step out of the matrix. Some form of this is everywhere. But what happens when you take too many red pills? When you embody the surface level ideas of the matrix too much? What happens when you overdose? So let's look into it. Similar to my last video on the Matrix, I'm going to be going into some of the ways where the themes or the surface level ideas can be twisted and used in a way that wasn't necessarily intended, but that normal people or just your average moviegoer, average person on YouTube has just passively absorbed. We're going to talk about things like the trap of the Messiah, the double life issue, and how the villain may be the secret hero. First, before I get into all of that, I do want to say, I love The Matrix. I know I said this in the last video, but I don't want this to be taken like it's some anti-version of The Matrix. Like, I hate The Matrix or something like that. Actually, I think The Matrix is a lot smarter than people give it credit for. I think it's actually much deeper than a lot of passive people have just absorbed. I think another great example, which is something I've used in the past when I was talking about this last video, I talked about some of these examples. But one I didn't use was the movie Cuties. This kind of illustrates what I'm talking about here. And that is the movie, when you actually watch the movie Cuties on Netflix, and I don't necessarily recommend it, because it's a very controversial movie and it's really not that great. But the whole point of it was that, sadly, young women, or young girls in this case, are totally misused by Western culture and sexualized in a way that's perverted and against traditional culture. Now that was the idea, and a lot of people disliked it. That's why it was a big controversy on Netflix, and people were against it. But a lot of the reasons why people were against it is what was interesting. They were against it because they believed that the message of the movie was to sexualize young girls. That's what they believed. When in actuality, they were trying to say the opposite. Now, you might still dislike Cuties. You might think that it's not worth it. Even if that's an important point, it's not worth sexualizing them in the process, which I understand. That's a perfectly fine opinion to have. However, a lot of people thought that it was the opposite. They thought that was actually the point. The point was the sexualizing. That's what they were trying to do. And they missed it altogether. And that's because so often when people watch things, they watch things not for the deeper meaning, not for the criticality, trying to understand what the person is actually trying to say, what the filmmakers mean. Instead, they watch it for the explosions, or the hot chick, or the good-looking guy, or some cool new meme that's out, or everyone's going to see it. They don't see it for something deeper. And I'm afraid when you go into watching something with that mindset, you often end up absorbing the worst parts of it, the parts that are not intended, and the parts that can often be destructive. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. The first point I want to talk about is the loneliness of the double life. What do I mean by that? Well, Neo sets up in the very beginning of the movie, and it's kind of ironic because this is my second part of talking about the Matrix. But in the beginning of the movie, there's this whole idea that there's two separate Neos, or two separate people. That's Thomas A. Anderson, and then there's Neo. These two separate identities. One is online and is hacking and doing all these terrible things, while the other one, on the other hand, is just a normal person who works an office job. And why is this important? Because it shows almost the origin of the popularizing of this concept we see all the time, and that is we can be anonymous online. We can be, in some respects, more ourselves. And we'll get into how this is the case. We can be more of who we are. We can be more into whatever niche that we want to be in. We can totally obsess over crocheting, for instance. But we can totally obsess about whatever small little side hustle we want to do. While simultaneously, though, we also can have our worst impulses without any check, without anyone to stop us, because we don't have someone judging us over our shoulder. We don't have a friend who's going to look at us and be like, what are you doing? Who's going to call you out, because no one really knows. And so while in some respects we can be more of who we want to be, in other respects we end up being the worst version of ourselves when we're online. But there's this great quote that I'm gonna give now that Agent Smith says that kind of sums up this idea really well. And he says, "It seems that you have been living two lives. In one life, you were Thomas A. Anderson, a program writer for a respectable software company. You have a social security number, you pay your taxes, and you help your landlady carry out the garbage. The other life is in computers, where you go by the hacker alias Neo, and are guilty of virtually every computer crime we have a law for." In 2004, Professor John Suler, published an article in Rider University. And give me a second, I'm going to read some excerpts here. It was entitled The Online Disinhibition Effect. So what is that? Well, the disinhibition effect describes a loosening of social restrictions and inhibitions that are normally present in face-to-face interactions that take place in interactions on the internet. So why is this important? Well, like I was talking about before, this kind of separates into two separate ones. And he calls this benign disinhibition and toxic disinhibition. Benign disinhibition is when you feel more free to disclose things about yourself that you wouldn't necessarily tell, that you feel a little bit more free to be yourself, to focus on the things that you're more interested in. And there's this new level of freedom, and he calls that benign disinhibition, because the things that are stopping your inhibitions are not there any longer, because you're at a place where you don't have the structures of face-to-face contact. And that can be a positive thing, like we talked about before. But on the negative side, there's toxic disinhibition. And what is that? Toxic disinhibition is the anonymous troll. The anonymous troll who goes on there and he doesn't care. Why? Because there's no one else to stop him. There are no inhibitions. There's no one to say, you need to stop. There's no one who's going to ostracize him from his job or from his friendship group. And because of that, there's much more freedom to be an asshole online, to say whatever you want to say, to be the worst version of yourself, to allow the first thing that comes in your mind to be broadcasted out to everyone. And this is sadly where something like the Matrix has led to, or these kind of surface level ideas. Because when you popularize or you look at Neo, and by the way, when you actually think about the movie, he becomes more of his full self, more of his savior self, more of the actual Neo as he goes on. But the movie, when looked at from a surface level standpoint, still popularizes this idea of having two split identities, which leads to some toxic effects long term. Because even if you can be more yourself, which is a good thing, simultaneously that toxic behavior will pull you down. And if it starts to become mingled with the kind of persona you think you are, you're more likely to self-disclose, the benign disinhibition. You're more likely to be yourself, say what you like and dislike. And at the same time, you're also more likely to be toxic. Those things can meld together, blend together, until who you think you are, your full version of yourself, your whole self, ends up being much more toxic. Because when you're more yourself online, it's also mingled with that toxicity. So this positive thing also comes with its negative part too. And that's where I have to be totally honest. I am just as guilty of this as anyone else. And I hope less of the toxic part, but definitely of the benign disinhibition, of thinking, being more likely to self-disclose and focus on what you want to and what's important to you. This channel is a great example of that. And I think we fall into the other part of this is this loneliness, this feeling of, well, you can't really be your full self out with everyone else. And so the only place you can go to is the internet. The only place you can go to is where all of your favorite things are, where your interests lie. And in those places, you can find some level of community, but that drives this wedge between you and your friends and your social circle. And like I said, I think a lot of Gen Z is guilty of this, but somewhat not necessarily our fault. I mean, what choice do we have? We're presented with something that is a huge opportunity, but this is the pitfall. The pitfall is this kind of striking down the middle, this bisection of us having two lives, the one in front of everyone and the one behind the scenes. And both have aspects of who we are, some more than others depending on the person, but both have aspects. And when you feel like you can't be your full self with people and you're cut between, it can make you even more lonely and drive this feeling of isolation. Like, forget even the toxic part. Just the benign disinhibition, just disclosing more and feeling like you're more interested in the things online, just makes this separation between who you are in real life, who you are online, and feeling like you can't square the two and you don't have those connections. The next thing I want to talk about is what I will call the savior snare, and that's how we often feel because of the online world and this hyper individualism. And I'll go into some specifics of what I mean, but we often feel like we are too special, too exceptional. And when I say exceptional, I don't necessarily mean like we're so great. I mean that we're exceptions to the rule, that everyone else acts a certain way, but not me. I'm the main character. This is where we get into this main character syndrome. And I think one of the big reasons this is the case is things like Neo. You got Neo, Harry Potter, Star Wars, you got all these like savior stories. But furthermore, not just that, the technology that is so much a part of the Matrix, that's so much a part of our modern lives, has this individualizing appeal to it, this individualizing push. And that is, for instance, we have our phone. And what is a phone? It's this singular device shining on one person, our own little portal to a whole world. And on and on and on, you can see this. Inside that portal are apps, and those apps all filter towards specifically you. And on those apps, you got feeds. Those feeds, once again, are filtered exactly to you. And so as we've matured in this society, as we've grown up, more and more is just filtered to exactly us. And it gives us this feeling of that everyone else is an NPC. And I talked about this a little bit in my last video, of how often the people who twist the Matrix and the ideas in it, they take blue-pilled people, normies as they call it, like all these slang terms for people who are just normal, everyday people, and they demonize them. They make them out to be the enemy. They call them blue pillars and NPCs. But one part that I didn't really hit on too much that I want to hit on here is that along with this individualism, along with this savior complex and this main character syndrome, is this feeling like everyone else is an NPC. They're kind of living in our video game, that they're just kind of guests, that they're along for the ride. They're second characters. And the problem with that is that it can often give us a very distorted reality. It can lead us to a lot of really big biases in ways that totally cloud our perception of the world, of events, of the people around us. I'll give you a couple examples. First, there's the fundamental attribution error. And all that is to say is that we are disproportionately likely to attribute bad things that happen to people to them, to who they are, to what they do. Whereas in us ourselves, this is called the actor-observer asymmetry. Us ourselves, we tend to think, well, it's not really us. It was something outside of us. It was something else. So if we're late, this is the classic example. If we're late, well, so many bad things happened to us that day. We had this happen and that happened. We went to brush our teeth, but then we have an electric toothbrush and we had to replace it, and so that made this. And we tend to blame all of the events for what happened and not who we are. We're not late people. We're actually punctual people. We wanted to be there on time. We just couldn't. And other people, on the other hand, they get the NPC treatment. They are that kind of thing. They are late people. They are bad people. They are liars. They didn't just fib accidentally. They didn't just say something they didn't mean. They are liars. They are distorters of the truth. That's who they are. And that's where we get in this like hyper-individualized, savior complex exceptionality. This feeling of we're special. We kind of see things a unique way. Other people, they might look at the news and they get the confirmation bias and they see what they want to see, but we can see what's real. And that's where it also coincides with that skepticism of the Matrix. The Matrix, sadly, all of the main characters have this mentality to them. And I mentioned in the last video when I talked about how they look at the people around them and they say, oh, well, if they're a part of the Matrix, they're our enemy. It's this implicit notion that we have what it takes to understand reality, that we have what it takes on our own to understand how things truly are, to see, oh, well, that's wrong and that's wrong. And I'm not saying that we can't do that. but to believe that it's second nature and that other people can't, and they're just sheep going about their business, while we, on the other hand, we're the exceptional ones. That is one of the distorted views, the distorted perceptions from the Matrix that I think has been really poorly taken. Because the truth is, we're like everyone else. We are subject to the same biases. We are just as likely to be the kind of person who's late as we are the type of person to just be late on accident. That's who we are. And when we act, whether it's those outside things like the algorithm making us feel like we're the center of attention and we're exceptional and everything is, individualized to us, or whether it's just inside of our heads. It's our own perception of things, that our own biases that cloud ourselves. Either way, we have to remember that we're like everyone else. And that's not to say that we're not special, because we have unique aspects to us. But when it comes to understanding the world, when it comes to seeing things clearly, we are subject to the same issues, the same pitfalls as everyone else. Now, my last point is probably going to be the most controversial. And that's the question, what if the villain was right? Now, I don't mean the evil robots. I mean Cypher. Cypher, who's seen as the Judas Iscariot, as the great betrayer of Trinity, of Morpheus, of Neo, that he might actually have a good idea. Now, let me explain myself. Obviously, I don't mean the betrayal. That was a bad idea. But the blue pill part is what I want to talk about here. How maybe that going with the blue pill and not the red pill was actually the right idea after all. So let's first talk about why would that even be the case. Let me ask a question. Is it really so terrible for someone to want a life where you're not constantly questioning everything, where you're not in some giant struggle that's good versus evil, where you're not in this rebellious, constant hard work? Is that really so bad? Now, you might think to yourself when I say that as, well, the quest of everyone is to try to come to the truth. Aren't we all trying to understand? Shouldn't we all have a work ethic? And let me ask you this. What are the most meaningful things that have happened to you? What are the things that matter the most to you? Now, yes, some of those will be because of hard work. That's very true. But some of them might also be very easy things, very simple things. It might be the time that you went with your girlfriend to the movies. It might be the time that you and your mom connected over a lunch. It might be the time that you and your dad, or you and your sister, or you and your best friend. But a lot of those things are not hard. They're not things that you had to slave over in order to accomplish. But they're the easy things, the simple things, the sweet things. And too often, I think the Matrix really perpetuates this idea, at least on the surface. Too often we have this glorification of hard work for hard work's sake, just because it is hard, just because it is not easy. We tend to think, oh, well, then it's worth doing. And is it such a bad idea that someone might want to enjoy their life? And I'm not talking about endless hedonism, and I think they kind of hint at that Cypher wanted endless hedonism. But pleasure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily bad for you to enjoy a good glass of wine. It's not necessarily bad for you to play a good video game. That's not necessarily bad. However, at the same time, I'm not necessarily talking just about hedonism, just about like endless pleasure. But I'm also talking about the easy things that are meaningful. The connections that we have, the relationships that we have. Too much of the surface level ideas of the Matrix is about this struggle against the bad guy, the struggle against the people behind the scenes, and trying to unravel their secret conspiracies of fighting this big epic back and forth. And we like to see ourselves that way, don't we? We like to see ourselves as a soldier for the good side, as trying to make a difference in people's lives, and doing that in the best way we can. Greg McKeown, and I might have butchered that name, talks about in his book Effortless, how there is this stigma in our society against things being effortless, easy, simple. We have this want almost, this need for things to be hard, because then it's an accomplishment. Then we can have meaning and purpose in what we're doing if it's hard. But that's not necessarily the case for the things that are the most meaningful, that are the most purposeful. There are many things that are that way, but aren't necessarily hard. And he attributes that to things like the Puritan work ethic and this kind of grind-set success culture. And sadly, the Matrix, at least on the surface once again, that plays into it. It plays into this kind of struggle that in order to be successful or to do the right thing, you have to kind of struggle with your friends against the enemy, against the bad guys. And it's not necessarily fun. It's kind of grimy. But there's this sort of romance about it because you're working hard as the underdog against these big terrible machines, against the Matrix, the system. So the first part of my point that's in favor of Cypher, in favor of kind of taking the blue pill in this case, is that the meaningful things, the things we're going to remember, aren't necessarily hard. They don't necessarily take a ton of effort. And sometimes they are pleasurable and they are important for us to have. And just going after the things that are difficult, that make you the underdog, doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing for you to do. Sometimes that's just the easiest thing for you to think of, to conceptualize, to tell yourself, sometimes it's more about the story than the reality. But even if, let's say you believe that, and you kind of take that into account, you say, well, they were fighting against the big bad enemy. Of course they had to. They were fighting against the robots. Well, this is where I get into my next point, where we're talking about the surface level details. That's the point. But even if that was the case, and we take, okay, well, a surface level person might still think he's still bad because he wasn't fighting against the evil robots. Okay, let's take that into account. But let me ask the obvious kind of, high-end weed question, and that is, what if it was all Matrix? What if it all wasn't real? What if even the struggle, humans versus the machines, wasn't real at all, and there was something even below that? And then what if there was something below that, and below that, and below that? And then we get into this infinite regress of questions. And that's the next point. The next point is when we live in this, when we internalize these ideas and live in this mindset, it ends up just becoming endless skepticism, endless questions for no reason. And it leaves us, once again, in this low, and I hit on this a little bit in my last video, in this low, drained, negative, sad state where everything has to be torn down. Nothing can be good, right? Everything has to be corrupt. We have to debunk everything. Any celebrity that might be worth something, they have to be torn down. There has to be some scandal about them. Every YouTuber we like, there must be some debunking or what this person has done wrong. Everything has to have its negative. And when we live in that, when we internalize those ideas, we end up making our lives so much worse. So much worse than when we would have just been naive, when we would have taken the blue pill, when we would have acted more like Cypher and just gone along with it, because we could have savored the connections I talk about in kind of my first part of this. We could have savored those connections, those easy, pleasurable, but important times we have with our loved ones, with our friends, the memories that would last. We could have savored those because we're not tearing them down with skepticism, because we're not tearing them down with questions and with useless cynicism nonstop. And sadly, I think that is one of the negative aspects of the surface level ideas in the Matrix, that it's taught so many people, particularly young men, that kind of see the negative side in everything, to constantly question. And questioning is not necessarily bad, but it isn't good either. And when we take it too far to the extreme, we don't have anything to hang our hat on, anything to build a foundation to believe in, to take pride and joy in. And that's why maybe being a blue-pilled person is better than being a red-pilled one. If that's what it takes, if it ends up degrading all these things and dragging so much down. And I think our culture, sadly, especially online culture, has internalized too much of this red pill cynicism, this red pill questioning and tearing things down. And if we had a little more of that Cypher blue pilled, if we actually enjoyed ourselves more, maybe a little more pleasure, not hedonism, but a little more pleasure, and if we focused more on the things that were more effortless, more easy, but that were important, like the connection we have with other people, like our connection with our family and friends, that we would be in a lot better circumstance than if we had followed this red pill surface level Matrix idea. Not only are these all reasons why everyone watching this and just people in general should watch their media more critically, try to understand the deeper meanings and not just the surface level ideas, but furthermore, I hope this goes into some questioning the questions, some undermining of the skepticism, some building up of maybe more connections, more of the important, meaningful things that are enjoyable, and not just the things that are hard or make us feel like we're some great part of the narratives, some great hero of our story, a savior, like I talked about earlier. I hope this does a good job of kind of building towards that, because I think it's a healthier place for myself, because I know I've fallen into these traps a great deal. But it's a better place for me, but I think it's a better place for everyone. If we can try to at least tune ourselves a little bit more towards that middle. There are definitely a lot of people who mindlessly follow, but too often, at least in the online world, and among Gen Z and young men, we tend to mindlessly question. And maybe if we can bring that over, maybe more of a purple pill, we'll all be better off for it. So that was a look into how the Matrix and some of those surface level ideas that a lot of people are passively allowed to influence them, have influenced them for the negative, and some ideas that I hope will help to influence people positively. So thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.